When Riot released Arena 2.0, I made this Gold Augment tier list. Then, when Riot Games made Arena 3.0, I decided to make a couple of changes to my old tier list, which I made in this very clear and easy to see little note I made to myself. But I ended up never actually releasing that video, so unlike my Silver Augment tier list that I just released, I'm going to go over my Gold Augment tier list a little bit more in depth and talk about things that have changed since my Arena 2.0 Gold Augment tier list. Now here is the original Gold Augment tier list that we had from Arena 3.0, but we're going to make a couple of changes to the tier list. First of all, we're going to change the good category to solid, just as I feel like that's a better term for this area. And then now, because I've played a lot more games of Arena, we can change the category of not fully tested into 2 different categories. We're also going to take out all of those augments and rate them shortly. And we're going to change that old category to 2 new categories, the first being either a top 2 finish or 8th place finish, and the other category just being simply meh. We're also going to change the almost useless category to awkward, and we're going to change the useless tier to undesirable, as at the end of the day, I guess technically no augments are useless. Now we'll have to re-rank all of the augments that used to be in the category where I needed to find more information, but we're actually going to start off by talking about the augments which are leaving the Gold Augment tier list. Now, if you watch my Silver Augment tier list video, then you'll know that both Cannon Fodder as well as Dive Bomber have been demoted down to Silver tier. And again, if you watch that video, you'll see that I still am not the biggest fan of Cannon Fodder, still thinking it's one of the worst augments in the entire game. And also, Dive Bomber, now being a Silver Augment, is quite a lot better, especially because it didn't actually receive any nerfs from its Gold Augment form. The other augments we will be removing from this list are Itemizer and Backstab, as I believe they actually never were fully released. Just when I was making the tier list, I saw that they were teased at some points, but I haven't really found much information about them, or I don't remember where that information is. Just know they're not in the game. And finally, the other augment that is no longer here is Mythical. And honestly, I'm not even really sure what Mythical did. Okay, I just remembered because I googled it. Mythical allowed you to have more than one mythic item in the game. And of course, that made sense when mythics exist in the game. But now that mythics no longer exist, then of course, Mythical will also no longer exist because you don't have a limit on buying certain items anymore. Now we'll give an official rating to all of the augments I need a little bit more information on. And after that, we'll rate the 12 new gold augments that we're getting to the game. And finally, we'll finish off the tier list by reshuffling some of the old ratings I gave as things have changed, as well as my opinion, which has changed over time from playing the game. Now, in order not to waste anybody's time, I won't go too in-depth in any of the augments I've already talked about in my previous video. So if you want to see me take a really deep dive into any of them, feel free to check that out. So let's quickly run through some of these. Holy Fire is the augment that when you heal and shield, it then causes you to deal burn damage to other people. And honestly, I'm just going to put it in the awkward tier. It's kind of a weird position because if you're playing an Enchanter style champion, when you're going into the game, you're not really anticipating dealing damage. So once you get Holy Fire, you then go from being a character that was expected to like support your teammate into being one that might be pivoting towards kind of dealing damage instead. And the damage itself isn't like even that much. And giving up other augments or opportunities to better support your teammate who could be the one pumping out the damage and instead being like a second damage dealer doesn't really make that much sense in my eyes. Maybe Holy Fire could be good in some kind of weird like Warwick build or Mordekaiser build, but I've never really lost to anybody running Holy Fire, and I've myself like taken it on champions like Soraka and it hasn't been really that impressive. Same with like Sona, not really ever died to anybody running Holy Fire, and for all these reasons, I'm definitely going to keep it in the awkward tier. Next we have its Killing Time, which sounds like a really cool augment where you apply Zed's Death Mark after you ult, where you store 40% of all pre-mitigation damage, and then you deal it to the targets 5 seconds afterwards. And honestly, it does sound like it would be really cool, but every time I take its Killing Time, the damage from it doesn't seem that impressive. if you're kind of going for a really strong like ultimate build where you're like just want to one-shot somebody with your ultimate, usually you have other things in your kit where if you don't finish them off already with the rest of your kit, it's very rare for like its killing time to then kind of be the difference maker. Maybe honestly, it's now that I'm thinking about it, its killing time could be better on like your more supportive style champion, because then the carry itself could take a bunch of high damage augments. It just stores damage that the target takes like from anybody, right? So in that theory, it could be good. The one thing I'll say, every time you take its killing time, the damage, whenever I look at it, doesn't look impressive. It doesn't feel that amazing. Usually they end up dying before it actually procs. So for all these reasons, I'm gonna put it for now at the top of awkward. It sounds really, really good, but just in practice, I mean, I've seen it enough times, I've taken it enough times, it sounds a lot scarier than it ends up really being, because more often than not, if you're going to die to some ultimate play, you're already going to die to that ultimate play, and its killing time doesn't really do that much more, it feels like. Though I could be wrong, I'm willing to admit that, just personally, not too impressed with this augment. Now we have Parasitic Relationship, where you heal for 15% of the damage dealt by your ally. And honestly, this might come as a surprise, but I really don't like this augment. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. The problem with Parasitic Relationship for me is oftentimes in Arena, both people are just really focusing on one target. So if the people are just really hard focusing like your AD carry or squishier type champion, then it doesn't matter that you're healing from the damage they're dealing, because you're not taking any damage. You're going to be like full health the whole time. So you're pretty much just down an augment, because as soon as your teammate gets shut down, you're just by yourself, and Parasitic Relationship will literally do nothing for you. So could be good in like a double carry setup, or if you're fighting against a lot of AoE. But if you're fighting against a lot of AoE, oftentimes what happens if you just get like caught by the AoE combo, you're going to die anyways. So very rarely I see a good time for Parasitic Relationship in the late game, I'll say. In the early game, you are more likely to see situations where the fights are more drawn out. But in the late game, I do think this falls off a really hard cliff, and it's one of the reasons I just don't like this augment. And I think in Arena, if you think about it, it just is a bit weird, because like, for instance, Knight's Vow in League of Legends, it's pretty decent, because if you're fighting against like Xerath on the enemy team or just some kind of poke, then you as like the Braum, for instance, will be healing up, which is nice. But you're not really fighting against too many poke comps where then your ADC is able to hit. The fights are just way more explosive, and yeah, just not a fan of this augment, even though it does sound cool. Now we have the Quest Angel of Retribution, and honestly, this augment is pretty cool in theory, where when you heal allied champions for 2,500 or you mitigate 2,500 damage for them, usually through like shielding, then you get this reward where you gain 100% bonus attack speed and empower your basic attacks to deal bonus damage equal to 350% of your heal and shield power. But kind of similarly to Holy Fire, this is just not really the best on a lot of support-based like team comps in Arena. It could be good if you do like Ultimate Bravery, you just end up getting a support and you have like a weird team comp anyways. Might as well take Quest Angel of Retribution and hope it works out. I could see this being better on kind of champions like maybe Belvath or Urgot if you go for like a weird heal kind of combo with like Sword of the Blossoming Dawn, which I think is a really, really strong item. Then I can see Quest Angel of Retribution being like sneaky good. And for that reason, I'm actually going to put it in top 2 or 8th. A lot of times you'll just end up never proccing this and going 8th, or you proc it in the last fight and it's too late because you just were down a gold augment the whole time. Being down a gold augment really, really sucks, because for the whole time you don't have this activated, it does absolutely nothing. So there is a very good chance you just end up finishing bottom 2. But if you do somehow get all of the perfect conditions, then yeah, you might have the chance of getting a top 2 finish. But more often than not, you might end up seeing yourself finishing bottom 2. So be careful if you take this. Now we have Blood Brother, which is the most unique augment in the game, literally, because it can only be offered to Draven, and what it does, it gives you Darius passive, and it's honestly really strong because you just get a bunch of bonus attack damage. Goes all the way up to 270 if you can get max stacks, which is pretty strong for a Draven. Honestly, I'm going to put it in the strong but niche category, because if you're really good at Draven, actually I'm going to put it in the solid category, because I don't think it's ever like that amazing, where I think some of the other ones in strong can be like more potentially good. And I honestly don't think Draven is the best champion. Like, he's kind of awkward to play already in the game, so unless you're like really good at Draven, then it doesn't really matter if you're going to get Blood Brother. I don't think it's really going to matter anything, because you're playing Draven when you're not very used to playing a more difficult champion like that. And also I don't think like crit ADCs have the best spot right now in Arena. It's a bit awkward all around. He doesn't have any mobility. He just has a lot of things going not well for him. So yeah, I mean, you might be wondering why I'm talking so much about Draven, but that's because that's what I have to do when I talk about Blood Brother, because they just are one and the same. So I think if you are playing Draven, definitely give Blood Brother a good chance. I think it'll be solid for you, but at the same time, I don't think it's that game breaking, because you are, at the end of the day, still playing Draven. But for Draven, it is definitely going to be one of his best augments out there. Now we have critical healing, where your heals and shields now have a chance equal to 100% critical strike chance to increase in effectiveness by 40%, and additionally you gain 25% critical strike chance. And you can see that when they made Arena, I guess it would be 2.0, they added a bunch of augments for supports to maybe help them carry a little bit. But honestly, like, it's kind of hard for supports to carry, and you kind of have to go into a game either having like the support knowing it's going to end up being the carry and praying that it gets some of these augments, just because like it's really weird to build crit items as well, and only being rewarded with like better healing isn't that amazing. Honestly, I think this is probably just best on maybe like a champion like Warwick or Swain if you have like other good crit synergies. I don't think it's going to be the best on supports. There's just not that many like ADC champions with a bunch of sustain that also build crit. Honestly, yeah, champions that build crit don't really build that much sustain usually, so you're just in this overall weird state. So unless you have a lot of other conditions going for you, critical healing will feel very underwhelming. And just because of all of those conditions, I'm going to put it in the awkward tier for sure. Now we have Oathsworn, which replaces your Flea with Callista's ult. And honestly, while it doesn't sound like much, this augment is pretty strong and in many different interesting cases. For instance, you could take it on your ADC champion to allow your engage style champion to have better engage, or you could take it on your engage or like peel style champion to help your carry disengage, because if they're getting jumped on, Oathsworn is one of the best ways to protect them, because if you think about it, it's like a Zanya's effect that also gives them like a really big flash. It also gets around CC effects, which is really good. So Oathsworn, while it doesn't do any damage and it's not that exciting, it just has so many potential use cases. I definitely think it's strong, but definitely niche, because you have to remember that you have Oathsworn, which can be sometimes a struggle, and you have to utilize it in really effective ways in order to maximize the value of it. But if you do all of those things, then Oathsworn can really shine. Now, those are all the augments I was a little bit unsure of when I made my Arena 2.0 tier list, and we can finally go into the new augments. To begin with, we have And My Axe, which allows you to automatically cast Olaf's Undertow, which is his Q ability, and this deals damage that scales with your AD and can also scale with your AP. It slows enemies by 40% for 1.5 seconds, and it also can reduce their armor and magic resistance by 20% for 4 seconds, and this has an 8-second cooldown. The really interesting thing about And My Axe is that it has the same exact thing as Olaf has on his actual Undertow, where you can pick it up to lower the cooldown. And honestly, this augment is a little bit underwhelming. I'm going to put it in the meh tier. The best use case for it is if you're like a champion, kind of like a bruiser champion, like Olaf, for instance, and you just want to stick on the champion, just constantly run them down, then it can be hard for them to kite if you like hit an axe and get lucky, pick it up, throw it again, constantly keep them slowing. And just the fact that it does reduce their armor and magic resistance is nice for both you and your teammate. Doesn't really matter if they do magic damage or if you do armor damage. That alone is a really nice effect. Just the fact that it still casts randomly and it isn't something that you can aim on your own, so sometimes it will just whiff and do absolutely nothing. And the damage itself isn't too spectacular, doesn't allow me to rate it any higher, and it's not one of my favorite augments, making meh a perfect place to put it. Now, technically, these two augments I'm going to talk about aren't new, as they have existed before, but they have changed quite a bit, and those are going to be the curse stacking augments in Dark Blessing and Death Touch. Let's start off with Dark Blessing, where the next instance of healing or shielding you grant to or receive from an ally generates 4 curse stacks and deals bonus true damage equal to the number of them you have generated in the current round. And again, like I talked about in the Silver Augment tier list, you can only generate up to 30 curses per round. And your reward for having curses is that you permanently gain ability haste equal to 33% of all curse stacks generated. Honestly, Dark Blessing just feels kind of meh. Oftentimes, in the early game, you might be able to get a fair amount of stacks because you're healing or shielding, but then when you're going towards the later part of the games, sometimes the rounds will be just way too fast, where as an Enchanter, you don't actually get that many chances to do a bunch of heals and shields. You just like only get like 1 or 2 really pivotal ones, and just stacking it in general is pretty awkward. You need a heal and shield about 7.5 times in order to get the maximum stacks on this, which isn't impossible, but still not too impressive. I think it's better to take like as your second curse augment, or if you have other curse augments already, just because you can then get more curses every round, but then you have the same problem where it is just harder to stack them in general. If you take it like second when you already have another curse, then you automatically get ability haste equal to the previous curses, so that's alright. I'm just a little bit underwhelmed by all of the curse augments. This one's kind of like a gut feeling that I just have, where I'm just like, man, it just doesn't feel that great. And for that reason, I'm just going to keep it in meh, especially Dark Blessing. Now, Death Touch is the other curse augment, but instead of like having to use abilities, you just have to basic attack enemies, and each time you do, you generate 2 curse stacks, and again, you can get up to 30, and then your reward is that you get bonus magic damage on hit equal to all of the stacks generated. And honestly, as funny as it sounds, 15 auto attacks doesn't sound like that much, but in some rounds, you'll just get jumped on immediately by like a Talon or a Master Yi or like a Malphite, and you might end up getting 0 curse stacks or like 1 or 2, and then your augment kind of sucks. The same thing kind of applies to Dark Blessing. There might be just some rounds where you get absolutely no value from this because it takes a while for it to ramp up. I do think Death Touch is a little bit easier to stack in theory because it is auto attacks. Maybe you can take this on a little bit more of a tankier champion, or if you're not fighting against like super burst champions, it could be alright. But even the reward itself isn't that amazing, because like if somebody's just super duper tanky, you're not doing like percent health damage, which again is just always going to be king in Arena. So for all these reasons, I'm also going to put this in meh, maybe 1 above Dark Blessing. Just super duper underwhelming, which is sad to see, and my prediction is going to be that these augments are gonna receive some buffs in the future, I can imagine, just because right now they feel underwhelming, and to have your super cool scaling augments feel this bad to take is quite sad to see. So I'm imagining it's gonna get buffed in a patch, then be absolutely ridiculously bonkers, and everybody's gonna hate them, except for the people who, of course, get them. And maybe then on the 3rd or 4th patch, we'll find a happy medium where they're not too ridiculous, but they don't feel absolutely terrible which they kind of feel right now from what I see. We can go back to brand new augments with Divine Intervention, which automatically casts Hatrick's ultimate, which calls down a protective star upon you that descends over 2.5 seconds. And then afterwards, you and a teammate, if they're nearby, become invulnerable for 2.5 seconds. And this will automatically activate 12.5 seconds after the start of the combat phase. And honestly, this just might be the perfect definition of awkward, because wow, this is just such a weird and hard to utilize augment, because enemies can hit tab and see that you have Divine Intervention, and I mean, it doesn't take that much brain cells to see the Hatrick ult coming down and knowing like, oh, that was not the time to engage, or we need to engage really fast. It's kind of hard to like force the issue with Divine Intervention, kind of similarly to Hatrick himself. Like, you see he's ulting, notice that, and then pull back, like wait a little bit, then go for it. And unlike Hatrick, you actually can't control when the ultimate is happening. It's guaranteed to come at this 12.5 second mark. So you just really have to hope that all of these conditions happen at the perfect moment where this Divine Intervention in 12.5 seconds isn't too late to save you when you're like about to die, but at the same time the enemies don't just wait until after Divine Intervention goes off and then absolutely runs you down. So you need to somehow win the fight in this really quick 2.5 second window. Maybe the enemy chokes and panics when they see the Divine Intervention, but honestly, quite an underwhelming, awkward augment, and that's why it's perfect for this tier. Now we have Flashy, which isn't a new augment, but it's been upgraded from silver to gold, and actually has been nerfed, funnily enough, where your flash now has 3 charges with a 3-second cooldown, which has been increased because it used to be 2-second cooldown, and now it's 3-second cooldown. And you gain these maximum charges at the start of each phase in a round. And additionally, your flash's cooldown is now reset every round. Actually, the one thing I could think of is maybe Flashy beforehand, like you just had 3 charges, but then you had to like conserve or use them properly. I don't really remember. I'm not the biggest fan of Flashy in general. It just isn't that fun. Like, Flash is kind of just like a necessary evil in League of Legends, or necessary like good thing. It just allows you to do a lot of plays if you're a champion that really wants to have Flash to either escape or to engage. Then Flashy is really good for you, but that's more a telltale sign that your champion itself is really good, because if it just is being hindered by the Flash ability, that means your champion is maybe a little bit broken, because if you think about it, Flash itself doesn't really do anything, does no damage, just keeps you like a little bit safe. So if you like are a weaker arena champion and you take Flashy, you will still feel absolutely useless. For these reasons, I'm gonna put it in the med tier. Flashy is good if your champion is broken and one of its limiting factors is not having access to enough flashes. Then Flashy is the perfect augment for you. But in every other circumstance, Flashy will feel rather underwhelming. Now we have Hatrick, which is a very interesting augment where you gain 3 hats upon selecting the augment, and you permanently reduce the cost of Kappa Juice in your shop by 350. And when you buy Kappa Juice, I believe you get a hat. It might be 2 hats. I'm actually not sure. Well, you either get 1 or 2 hats. And the way Hatrick works is that upon dropping below 30% of your maximum health, you get a shield based on your movement speed. Oh, interesting. Okay. But then you end up losing a hat every time this happens. And in all honesty, an augment that could end up just becoming useless after one fight unless you buy more hats kind of feels bad. I wonder if there's a strategy where you just buy a bunch of hats on a really fast champion and you just get like a super long shield, but then if you get like one bad fight, because from what I can see, you could end up losing all of your hats in one fight, especially if like the enemy team trolls you and just like keeps procking you down to this like lower level. If they like know you're not going to be able to beat them, they could like proc your hat wait a little bit, proc your hat again, wait a little bit, proc your hat again, and then you just have no more hats, from what I understand. All of these reasons, it's why I've never actually taken Hatrick myself. I don't think I've seen anybody else ever take it. And for those reasons, I'm gonna put it in undesirable at the bottom for now. It's an interesting concept, but it's just like so impossible for me to click it because I see so many terrible instances where this could go so wrong that it concerns me. I know you get some hats for free later on if you like eliminate teams. So honestly, I should give Hatrick a try. Maybe my instincts are wrong and I'll just ignore them, fight back against my instincts saying how terrible this could end up being. But yeah, just the fact that it's only effective when you're low, and it's not making you like invincible either. Like in theory, you could just still get absolutely blown up, lose a hat. But like if like a Malphite Kennen combo comes or something like that, or Rammus is on you with Sunfire just melting your health, like I don't know. is Hatrick really gonna do anything for you? Interesting, maybe augment. Honestly, I think Riot was just cooking a little bit too much with his augment, and we just got something that got completely burnt. Next up, we have Light Warden, which automatically casts Lux W, Prismatic Barrier, which throws a warding light towards your ally, which grants a shield for 40 to 100, and it scales with your bonus AD and AP, and it gives you the shield to you and your ally for 2.5 seconds, and then but only if it hits them, of course. So oftentimes what will happen is your teammate will accidentally juke it, especially because you have no idea when it's casting. And then once it reaches maximum range, it'll come back and it will grant the same shield again if it hits your ally. So, and it will stack with the previous shield. So you're always guaranteed to get the shield. If you have no AP, then like let's say you're a full tank, then you're getting a 100 shield every time this happens at a random time. That sounds absolutely terrible. Hopefully that's not true. Yeah, the one time I took Light Warden and it was really good is I was playing Singed with Phenomenal Evil and I had like 1300 AP, and then just anything that scales with AP ends up being good. But besides that use case, I think Light Warden is kind of lackluster. I don't think anybody's ever played Lux and been like, wow, her W is really the ability that shines through. And sure, I mean, this augment is always going to do something for you, but you just have to remember there's opportunity cost to everything, and you could be taking any of these other augments, in theory, that are just better. So why would you take Light Warden, which just gives a little bit of a shield? Like, if you really, really love Lux's Prismatic Barrier, I guess you could just play Lux, right? Yeah. Interesting idea. Kind of poor execution, I guess, is the best way to say it. And I definitely think And My Axe is a lot better and interesting because he's taking one of Olaf's best abilities and giving you the chance to use it, and it just does way more in general than a little bit of a shield. Honestly, Riot has released some very hard to rate augments just because oftentimes they just sound bad in theory. And speaking of which, we have Slow and Steady, where your base attack speed is set to a static amount of 0.625, which sounds terrible, and you no longer benefit from attack speed bonuses by any source, so your attack speed is always going to be 0.625. And then the benefit of this is that additionally, you convert every 1% bonus attack speed into 0.75 bonus attack damage. And originally my thought was, wow, that is just absolutely terrible. But then when I thought about it more, there are some champions that might be able to actually utilize this fairly okay. Like one I thought was maybe Ezreal if you want to do like a pure Q build, but you still wanted to build like Bork and like on-hit items for some reason. Because like then you could just like play constantly around the Q and you'd get like a fair amount of bonus attack damage in theory. Maybe it could be good on someone like Bel'Veth. I don't actually really know how this interaction would work. It's just definitely something I've thought of. If that's something you know, definitely let me know in the comments below. Again, maybe you could play some other like lethality based champions who don't auto attack too much and just want to like blow you up like with abilities like Zed. Maybe like Talon, that could be something. Editor Borax the Mighty here. I just wanted to quickly say the best champion to use slow and steady is by far Jace, because I ended up playing against that pretty recently, and his W gives him a bunch of attack speed, which then converts into a bunch of AD, and he can just straight up one-shot you, which is really funny, but definitely something I can imagine getting nerfed out of the game pretty quickly. This kind of ends up being a math problem where does a build that revolves only around bonus attack speed outscale the build that just builds normally and just builds AD? That's kind of going to be the question at the end of the day. And because I hate doing math and I don't really play AD assassins too much, I'll let somebody else do that math. I'm going to put in the awkward tier. So if it ends up being true that a slow and steady build greatly outperforms like a lethality build, then I at least was able to visualize that concept, just wasn't too willing to do the math right now on that, but who knows, maybe that changes sometime in the future. Well, I was just complaining that the augments were a little complicated to understand, but we do now have stats on stats, which when you select it, you just get 3 stat bonus anvils immediately. This augment is always going to be useful. I mean, it could also be like kind of unlucky if you get bad stat anvils. If you get like 3 subpar silver anvils, it's not the best. The one thing I don't like about stat anvils is they're not the most like multiplicative in a way. It's like a way I want to say it. It's like they're kind of like flat stats. Like actually you get like diminishing returns. Like if you have a bunch of MR and armor just from stat anvils, it's like if you have 500 armor, it's like not that much of a difference between like you having 300 armor or like the difference between 500 armor and 300 armor is a lot less than the difference between like 300 armor and 100 armor, if that makes sense, just because of the way like league math works. That's just something to keep in mind. Like I would rather have something that gives like 20% extra armor and MR, or just like things that like unlock your champion to do new unique things, or like allow you to unlock your champion in new specific ways. And stats on stats doesn't really do it for me most of the time. You could high roll and get really good shards. Like you could get a prismatic shard, that would be amazing, especially like in the early game. Maybe you get like a prismatic fortune shard, you just get 500 gold per round. Amazing. Definitely a high risk augment that you could high roll, but it's not something that interests me too much, so I haven't taken it that often. I'm going to put it in the met tier, and I can imagine it outperforms some other augments and like could find like a good like middle ground where it's like just always decent, because you're not really like chasing a really high, you're just getting stat anvils, and maybe other people are chasing really high highs and they fall short, and you end up having the stat anvils. So if you just like really enjoy getting 3rd, 4th, 5th, maybe this is the perfect augment for you. It's just not something I enjoy that much. Unless, of course, the chance of getting a prismatic anvil is higher than I actually think. Then I would like stats on stats a lot more, but that's just something I don't really know off the top of my head. That's just not something I know off the top of my head. I believe like it rolls like in the background, because I saw in the PvE like rolls a number between 0 to 100 and then gives you a correlating like option of like silver anvils, gold anvils, and prismatic anvils. I don't know if prismatic was just like 90 to 100, meaning it's a 10% chance. Again, that's something probably somebody knows out there. But yeah, if you like stat anvils, this is the augment for you. Now we have Summoner Revolution, where using a summoner spell resets its cooldown immediately after its effect starts or has elapsed, and this may occur only once per phase in a round, meaning you could immediately flash twice, you could immediately flee twice, or you could immediately like Oathsworn twice, you could immediately like Snowball twice, or if you have like the Prismatic Augment where you get random champion's ultimate placed on your summoner spell, then Summoner Revolution could be really, really strong. Or again, if you're just a champion that really likes flashy, then Summoner Revolution might be better, just because you immediately get like 2 flashes instead of having to wait 3 seconds between the flashes. So Summoner Revolution, kind of a better augment than flashy in theory. I'm gonna end up putting it in top 2 or 8th. even though I feel like that's a little bit harsh because I don't think you're just like gonna get 8th with this one. The reason why I'm putting it in this category is because if you do have those conditions where you have really good summoner spells because of other augments, then Summoner Revolution obviously becomes so much better. So for that reason, you're probably going to top 2, but if you don't really have those conditions, I imagine like 3rd through like 8th could be more realistic for you. Unless, again, you just really want to have Flash, then sure. Now, if you like the high risk, high reward game plan and want to take stats on stats, you could have more fun, in my opinion, and instead take Transmute Prismatic, where you could get an absolutely bonkers Prismatic Augment while everybody else gets Gold Augments and just instantly win the game. Or you get a Prismatic Augment that just absolutely sucks and kind of ruins the game for you. And for these reasons, I'm going to put it in top 2 or 8th. Realistically, you're probably not going to get 8th because you still have a Prismatic Augment, and very few of them are like straight up just terrible for you. Unlike the Transmute Gold Augment, where a random Gold Augment is much more likely to miss, I think there's very few Prismatic Augments that if you do end up getting it, you can't utilize it in any way whatsoever. And for that reason, I do think that Transmute Prismatic is quite strong. Just, I also believe that there's a lot of really good Gold Augments out there. So maybe there would have been a better choice for you. But if there wasn't, then I love Transmute Prismatic, and I almost always click it whenever I see it. Doesn't mean that I always win with it either. Trickster Demon is a very hard augment to rate just because I've played a lot of arena games, but one, this is a new augment, right? So the chances of me seeing it are a bit lower. And then on top of that, it's a very specific augment where it can be only applied to champions that exit stealth or have traps. So pretty much only Teemo and Shaco actually fulfill both of these conditions now that I think about it. Because the way this augment works is that upon exiting stealth, you unleash an explosion in a 300 radius around you. That deals a pretty impressive 60% of your AP in magic damage to nearby enemies. And once your clones or your stealth traps get destroyed or they're expiring, they will also trigger this effect around them. So honestly, I think this is a very powerful augment on Shaco or Teemo. For some reason, I was thinking you could like maybe take this on Heimerdinger, but I don't think that's even possible. I think it is only specifically for those champions, or if you get like very specific augments that then allow you to kind of utilize Trickster Demon, but still like you wouldn't end up having the stealth traps because there are no augments that give you that. So probably only a Teemo Shaco augment. So the question really is, how strong are Teemo and Shaco going to be? And it's just kind of hard to really analyze this augment, because again, you need these specific conditions. I do think that I'm going to put it in the strong but niche tier. I think that an effect that does plus 60% magic damage just from an augment is really nutty. Honestly, it could go in a higher tier. The only thing that's keeping it back is the fact that you do have to play those specific champions, so you have to be good at those champions. Those champions have to be pretty okay in the meta. I think Shaco is a pretty strong champion in that meta. I think for Shaco, this honestly could be like an OP augment. I don't think it's like game breaking, but I do think it would warrant OP. And for Teemo, you're not really like using your stealth to deal damage. Like you're not like popping out from a bush and then like proccing the damage. I mean, maybe you are, but I don't think that's really as realistic as like Shaco doing it, and Shaco benefiting from his clone and his stealth traps. Like it should work on his Shaco boxes. Just makes it seem like really OP on him. So I'm going to keep it in strong but niche, but I do think it's a lot better for Shaco than it is for Teemo. We've talked about vulnerability in my silver augment tier list, but let's talk about it now in my gold augment tier list and where I will place it. So it used to be a silver augment, and it's changed a little bit where you get 5% more critical strike chance, but you actually ended up losing 5% damage on the critical strikes. I'm not sure why Infinity Edge saying plus 40% is here. I mean, maybe it's telling you that like if you have Infinity Edge, it would increase the damage. So a little bit confusing. But what this does is that it allows your damage dealt by items and damage over time effects to critically strike. And I think the best damage in the game right now is damage dealt by items and damage that comes from over time effects. So I think vulnerability is game breaking, because if you're able to now crit and make those things do 145% more damage, you're in a really good spot. You can get some wacky builds in there. Like, I know there's like Hamstringer with vulnerabilities, like one shots people. You can go like with mages. You could then look into like going the crit mage item, and then like your Leandry's burn will start doing damage. Will do like extra damage. I think Sunfire right now is really broken. You could go like Atma's Impaler. I think that's what the item is called. At least that's what the old health crit item was called. There's just like so many things you can do with vulnerability that unlocks like such strong potential, that I do think that even though it used to be a silver augment and now it's just been upgraded to a gold augment, I do think it goes straight up to the highest tier in game breaking and is going to end up being one of the best augments out there. It can be a little bit lackluster, especially in the early game, because it doesn't really do anything at all, because you don't have much damage over time or items that deal damage. I know you used to in the arena stat adjustments, everybody like did on-hit damage, but I think they might have gotten rid of that. It does look like they got rid of the on-hit damage that every single champion had in arena, which honestly really kind of hurt the on-hit like attack speed champions, which I think not enough people really consider. Like, again, I don't see it anywhere here. So that was something that vulnerability used to enhance even in the early game, but that's now gone. That was a little bit of a tangent, and it doesn't really matter because vulnerability is still really, really strong in the mid to late game. The final new gold augment we have is We'll Be Right Back, which replaces your flee with time stop and would be, funnily enough, a very good augment with Summoner Revolution. But what time stop does is immediately puts yourself in stasis, and after a 0.33 second delay, all nearby champions as well will be put in stasis. You get like the Zanya's effect, and then the stasis lasts 1.75 seconds for yourself and 2.5 seconds for all other champions affected, meaning you'll be getting out of the stasis before other people, so you're able to react just a little bit before they do. And the entire time you're in that stasis, you will be healing for 5.714% of your missing health, a crazy number, which ends up being up to a total of 40% of your missing health. This is a very, very strong defensive augment, one of the best in the game. If you're dealing with a bunch of burst damage from like assassins, then We'll Be Right Back and Oathsworn are some of the best ways to deal with it. Building Zanyas just to not get burst is like a very good strategy, and the fact that you don't have to build Zanyas anymore, you can just go We'll Be Right Back, or you could go Zanyas and We'll Be Right Back, is pretty decent. You can also save your teammate if you need to in a pinch. You also heal, which is quite impressive. It does suck that you end up losing Flee, because Flee is a pretty decent summoner ability to help you get away, but Time Stop is just a lot better, and you actually might even end up getting more than one off because the cooldown isn't too long, so it's not super duper unrealistic, especially in the early games, to get more than one We'll Be Right Back off. Honestly, I think this augment ends up just being OP because it is such a good defensive augment. The best form of protection if you're a squishy champion is to be invulnerable. You control it. And sure, Divine Intervention gives you invulnerability, but that one you can't control. And that one has other conditions. And sure, you can do damage during Divine Intervention, and We'll Be Right Back you can't, but We'll Be Right Back you heal during it. So while Divine Intervention might save you when you're 1 HP, We'll Be Right Back will actually heal you up to 40% health if you were 1 HP beforehand, which is just really good. And I think this augment is very frustrating to play against, but very fun to utilize for yourself. Now we have placed all of the newer augments onto the tier list, but it is far from finished, as we do have to make a fair amount of adjustments. But I'll try to make them a bit faster, not go into too much detail about each augment. And again, if you do want to see more details about each specific augment, feel free to go to my previous video, as it is all time-stamped. But without further ado, let's start from the bottom and complete this tier list. In the undesirable tier, I'm going to end up moving Perseverance all the way to the bottom. I just really don't like this augment, and I'm probably biased against it in a bad way. Just the idea of base health regeneration doesn't really excite me. I feel like tanks just need more tankiness than just having a bit of regeneration. Having an augment that can be completely shut down with like anti-heal also really, really sucks. So for all these reasons, not a fan of Perseverance whatsoever. You're pretty much only going to want to take it on tanky champions too, I think, because like if you're low and you have that 1600 while below 25% maximum health, that's really only going to be good if you actually are a tankier champion, because if you're below 25% maximum health as a squishy champion, you're most likely going to die to one more rotation anyways. And just the fact that you can have this augment be really nerfed hard by anti-heal makes me just not a fan of it. Yeah, it can be good in the early game, but late game, I think it just absolutely blows. In my previous tier list, I talked about how much I just don't like the Keystone runes, and Keystone Conjurer originally was one tier higher, but nope, I'm putting it second worst augment. Arcane Comet and Summon Aerie are really good lane augments in League of Legends. Arena is not a lane-based game. You're not poking people out to force them to back so that you have more control of lanes and stuff like that. That's what these augments are good for. So in Arena, it's just not really a good augment. And if you don't believe me, just look at the damage of these augments throughout the game and compare it to other augments you could have chosen, and you'll be a bit disappointed. Sure, you might end up taking it just because they do things, but man, you're never winning a game ever because of these augments. Ever. Throughout the video, I've kind of trash talked a lot of the augments where you get a champion's ability, and OK Boomerang is not going to be safe from my wrath. This feels okay in like the first stage, the second stage, and then after that, it just does absolutely no damage. The scaling on it feels so bad. It casts at random times where you just might end up missing it. It's not guaranteed to hit. When it hits, it does so little damage. Like at most, like if you're super lucky and the enemy team comp is like really bad, I think the most you could maybe see from this is like 1,000 damage around, maybe 1,500, and that's like the highest use case. Usually you're just gonna end up getting like either 0 damage or like 200 damage, and it's just, no, it's not a good augment. Maybe if you have like a purely amazing auto cast setup, then it could be good, then it could be interesting, but the damage is just way too low. It's just way too inconsistent for me to think OK Boomerang is good. Cool looking augment, but a lot more trash than I think people realize. I'm actually going to bump up Restart to awkward because, yeah, like having your cooldowns refresh every 10 seconds might be good on some specific champions. Maybe you have a really long Q, W, or E ability, or like you just really want to combo a lot and maybe that helps you out. I just think you'd rather just have like raw CD from like recursion, for instance, or just other things, and it's like kind of hard to play around Restart. So not the biggest fan of it, but I do think it is a little bit better than undesirable. In the awkward tier, we're going to place Skilled Sniper, and this augment is cool in theory, where if you can keep the enemies far away from you, then you can constantly spam out your ability. But what happens if they're not far away from you? If they're on top of you, then you're just down a gold augment the entire game. And if the enemies know you have a Skilled Sniper and have any movement, like if you're getting hit by spears at max rank without like being CC'd, then you're kind of screwed anyways. Yeah, I don't know. Skill Sniper just does absolutely nothing if you have somebody that can close the distance on it, and then again you're just down a gold augment. But maybe there are some very niche cases where you can beat some teams because you have Skilled Sniper, but usually this just ends up being a dead augment slot that does absolutely nothing if people are on top of you. I'm definitely going to be a little bit too harsh on Restless Restoration, but I'm going to put it in the awkward tier. Not necessarily because it's actually that bad. I just do think it's awkward because, like, for instance, if you're just constantly getting CC'd, similarly to Skilled Sniper, you have an augment that just does nothing, which happens more often than you think. Like, I think CC is just really strong, or if you just get jumped on and one-shot, again, you have an augment that ended up doing nothing. I think this is pretty good in the early game. It actually does heal you quite a fair amount, but I much more value late game augments than early game augments, just because like that's usually when the damage you take is higher, and that's usually when you need like more clutch things. And I like to play arena trying to strive to get like a first or a second rather than like squeak out a fourth. So I'm definitely going to rate early game augments lower than perhaps some other people. Dawnbringer's Resolve is another augment I'm going to bring down to the awkward tier. It is a fair amount of healing, but it's a one-time use case, can get countered by anti-heal, and I just think there's other better things, like We'll Be Right Back is just so much better than Dawnbringer's Resolve, because you heal almost as much in a way. Well, you heal like a lot, and it makes you invincible while Dawnbringer's Resolve doesn't, so if the enemies are able to get over that threshold, they'll still be able to like destroy you. So it's not good on squishy champions, and on tank champions you'd rather have something that's constantly healing you and keeping you healthy. Oftentimes if you're a tank and you do ever drop below 30% maximum health, like you're kind of screwed anyways, it feels like a lot of the times, and just getting that one little bit of hit of extra health feels kind of underwhelming and just has too many drawbacks. Vanish is an augment that I definitely think is strong but niche, but in most cases it's just going to kind of be awkward. Like, if you're going to be useful with Vanish, that just means that your other conditions are really powerful, and then it almost doesn't really matter what augment you have. I think instead of Vanish, you'd rather have like Flashy or something like that. It is good for like also escaping. Actually, Vanish is oftentimes better because invincibility is pretty strong and can be kind of surprising, but you just have to use it really, really well. And unless you have like a lot of practice with Vanish, you have a very clear idea of what you're going to do, it doesn't like help you do more damage. So like I was saying, your champion already has to be in such a powerful enough state that you can take a weaker augment in order to utilize the rest of your power, but it itself isn't giving you the power, making it kind of an awkward augment to place. Like, for instance, Vanish and the early game is going to feel a lot worse because other people are just going to have more survivability, more damage than a champion that just can go invisible randomly. In the med tier, the first new addition is going to end up being Searing Dawn, which gives you Leona's passive, where your ability is mark enemies. And it's just like, it's like alright, you do notice the damage, it is kind of decent, but the damage just isn't that much. It's good in theory on champions like Cassio, for instance. If you like constantly hit them with ease, then your teammate, like for instance if they're like an ADC, they could constantly be proccing the sunlight damage, and in that combo it is strong but niche. But it's just like such weird use cases that it's not one of my favorites. I just do like it better than a lot of the awkward ones because it's always going to end up being useful, but it definitely isn't as strong as I initially thought it was. Now, while I bump down Keystone Conjurer, I'm actually going to bump up a lot of the other Keystone augments. We're going to start off with Demon's Dance, which gives you Fleet Footwork and Grasp of the Undying. And yeah, these Keystones are actually pretty decent. The max health you're getting from them isn't that great. At least it does give you some scaling in theory, and the Fleet Footwork gives you some movement speed. The Grasp gives you that little bit extra damage, and it does scale with your maximum health. So it just is like a fine augment. Truly the definition of meh. From beginning to end is gonna go up a little bit higher. This one gives you Dark Harvest and First Strike, and this is the definition of one of the most frustrating augments in the entire game, because if you end up getting poked first, then you lose your First Strike, and if you end up never getting the enemies low enough, you'll never proc your Dark Harvest. So this augment does have a lot of potential to do absolutely nothing, but if you're able to get your First Strike off, you might get a decent amount of gold. Try not to int because you're so excited to get that gold. That's something I do a little bit too much. So in those cases, it's nice. Dark Harvest is a little bit buffed. First Strike's definitely a little bit nerfed, so not the best. Like, you'll never see the damage really skyrocket, and again, there's a lot of times where it could just end up doing nothing, so definitely be careful with these augments. but they are a little bit better than I initially thought. Combo Master is gonna get bumped up as well, and initially I rated it quite low because Electrocute just like absolutely did no damage, but Electrocute got buffed, so it does a little bit more. And Phase Rush is just a solid rune in general. It helps you like get in the fight, it helps you get out of the fight, kite. So I do like Combo Master. It does two things decently, helping you kite, helping you do a little bit more damage. Just doesn't do either like that exceptionally. So again, perfect for meh tier. Banner of Command, I'm also going to bump down to meh. It replaces your Flee with Banner of Command, which just boosts your ally. And while it's like nice in theory, the playstyle of like playing with one person who can just like hard carry alone is kind of more of a dead concept from IC. So that makes Banner of Command in my eyes just weaker in general, because usually you need both teammates to be contributing in order to do well. And if one of your teammates has Banner of Command, that just means that they're down a hold Gold Augment. And I don't think there's too many champions in the game that with Banner of Command can 1v2 that easily. It's definitely not the worst augment, but I do think it belongs in meh. Now, top 2 or 8th is one of my favorite categories because, again, I like playing for the either first or second play style. And as much as it pains me to say, I'm going to have to bump down Quest Steal Your Heart from game breaking all the way to top 2 or 8th. Because, yes, if you're able to get Quest Steal Your Heart to work, it is almost like a top 1, 2, 3 finish just because of how much value you get from this. But a lot of the times, you just end up getting boned. You don't get your Steal Your Heart quest to work, and you just finish 8th because you were just down a gold augment for the entire game. You're guaranteed to be down a gold augment the first 2 rounds. You're almost always going to be down the gold augment for the 3rd round, unless you're crazy enough to sell your prismatic to buy Steal Your Heart. And then it might take like 1 or 2 rounds until you actually end up getting it. So in theory, there's like 6 rounds where you're just down a gold augment, which sucks. But if you're able to get there, man, it feels so good. But it's a lot harder done than said. In a similar vein, Quest Earth's Champion is also kind of similar to that. Getting the item is absolutely amazing, but you're just down a gold augment for so long. And I believe my friend was telling me that it's actually kind of bugged right now, so maybe it's a lot worse than I'm seeing. It's just like, it takes so long for you to end up getting this, and because you're down a gold augment, it's harder for you to get those takedowns in order to get your Quest Earth Champion. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of you just finishing 8th, because unless you're in a good spot, you're most likely going to really struggle in order to complete this quest. So the conditions you need is either you need to be a really OP champion, you need to like take this 2nd as an augment and you already have really other good setups, or your teammate just has to be like super duper strong that they're able to carry you and help you get those takedowns while you're still alive, so you get credit for the takedowns, of course, as well. In solid, we're gonna put recursion, which grants you 60 ability haste. It's solid. It's not going to win you most games. It's not going to lose you too many games. It's good, but it's definitely not like super duper strong. You're just happy to have it, so it's perfectly defined in the solid tier. Outlaws Grit is the exact same way as recursion. When you dash or blink, you gain bonus armor and bonus magic resistance up to 5 times, and the max you can get is 60 bonus resistances, which is really solid, but it doesn't help you do damage. And if the enemy just has enough damage where they kind of ignore your bonuses, then it's a bit lackluster, but it's still solid enough where, especially in the early games, like you do really like having the Outlaws Grit. And it's nice for champions that normally build like no armor and magic resistance, because then again, you're getting just a lot more value from Outlaws Grit. In Strong Niche, we're going to get a whole bunch of new augments, and we're going to start with one of my favorites, Celestial Body, which simply gives you 1,250 bonus health, but reduces your damage output by 10%. And like I've been saying beforehand, reducing your damage output by 10% does kind of suck, because you do want both members to be dealing damage to have a successful arena team in most cases. The bonus health is really nice. You want to take this augment if you know you're going for like health scaling things, like for instance Quest, Earth Champion, Celestial Body is nice. There's so many items that scale with health. So in those cases, the losing 10% damage is well worth getting that extra 1,250 bonus health. So it is strong, but niche because sometimes you will really feel that hit in the overall strength of your team. As a lot of augments just don't have a downside, and this is one of the ones that do, and the upside you get from it isn't like too insanely high. All for you, I'm just going to bump up one to strong, but niche. And honestly, it's mostly just because of like Yuumi, I'm thinking in my head. I think a lot of enchanters are pretty weak, but if you have a Yuumi on top of you with all for you, then just getting 30% extra healing and shielding is quite a big number. And there's a lot of items that scale with your heal and shield power, which I actually don't really know if all for you would benefit from that. I think it would, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't really play too many enchanters. It's not the most fun play style usually. But I do think that in very niche conditions, like if you are playing enchanter, all for you could be really strong. Now you might have thought I forgot about the final Keystone rune, but Impassable, which gives you Aftershock and Glacial Augment, is actually going to skyrocket all the way to strong but niche. And that's because Aftershock is kind of a crazy rune where you gain 35 flat to 35 flat magic resistance, and you gain 80% bonus armor and 80% bonus magic resistance, which is kind of insane actually, and there are caps on it apparently, which I didn't really know. You also deal damage that scales with your bonus health, and you have a lot of health on tanks, so the Aftershock can end up doing a lot of damage. And then you also get Glacial Augment, which is alright. The best thing about Glacial Augment is that you're reducing the enemy's damage by 15%, which is actually the same amount of damage reduction as Shrink Ray. So for that little bit, Impassable is just really, really strong. It just makes you as a tank very powerful in a very short amount of time. And sometimes that's just enough to make the difference in a fight and enough to just really frustrate the opponents, making me actually really enjoy this augment usually when I take it, because a lot of times when you're going in as a tank, if you can just survive that initial burst with your Aftershock, you'll be good to go for the rest of the fight. Thankfully, the next augment I'll be moving is its critical, which is right below it. And I'm just going to move this up one. Its critical is simple. It just grants you 40% critical strike chance. And the reason why I'm moving it up to strong but niche is because there's just so many good crit augments out there. And even the bad ones, like if you just need some more crit, being able to select this is just nice that you don't then have to worry about buying specific crit items, especially because the crit items themselves feel a little bit lackluster in my opinion, because they don't have like really cool bonus effects. So being able to avoid a lot of the weaker ones with its critical is very nice, as long as you have other things that really benefit from crit. Lightning Strikes, I'm going to end up moving down from OP tier to strong but niche. I think this is good on champions that get a bunch of attack speed naturally, like Master Yi, for instance, immediately comes to mind. But I just think like on hit, like straight up on hit champions are a little bit weaker in general. And usually they're doing damage outside of just like having raw attack damage, like for instance like Varus W or Kog'Maw W, or like just straight up like items like Bork are providing a lot of the damage. So you're usually doing more damage through just items in general and not straight up auto attacks, making me think Lightning Strikes still can be strong if you have a lot of attack speed, but isn't something that excites me as much, and maybe I'm still even overrating it a little bit. With Haste, I'm going to be bumping up from solid to strong but niche, because in the scenarios where you have a ton of ability haste, you'll be having a ton of movement speed, which is just a headache to deal with, because the person you're trying to get at will have all of their cooldowns always up, and it'll be very hard to catch them in general. So in those scenarios, with haste is an absolute nightmare, but you need those scenarios. The new addition to strong but not OP is going to be rabble rousing for me. I think one of the sneaky things in Arena is people don't really realize that certain tanks can end up having like a bunch of health, and people really hate building anti-heal. So a lot of times you'll be able to get away with rabble rousing without people building anti-heal. The reason why I like it better than other healing tank augments is that it scales with your maximum health, and you control when the healing happens because it's every time you use an ability, And as long as you have a lot of abilities to constantly cast, then you're going to be healing a bunch, which is why I think it's quite strong, but it's not OP because it does have the counterplay of anti-heal if the enemy team really needs it. Magic Missile is going to be another augment leaving game breaking, and it's going to go down to strong but not OP. I'm pretty sure when it first came out, it just did way more damage. Like, I want to say almost double as much damage. So definitely why it was game breaking at that time. Now it's just like a nice damage boost. Sometimes it can even feel a little bit lackluster. Other people still swear by its power, I see from time to time, which is why I'm still keeping it here. It does deal decent damage. It does percent maximum health damage, which I say I really, really like. It does true damage as well. So those two conditions keeps it for me in strong. But I think with the nerfs, it's no longer OP. I also am not sure of the additional condition where this effect can only trigger once every 6 seconds, if that was always in the game, because if it wasn't, that would make Magic Missile way more powerful. So I think there probably was a decent amount of nerfs. I'm going to look up old Magic Missile real quick. So yeah, here we can see that old Magic Missile was 0.7% to 2.1%, so literally more than double. And the cooldown was different because it was a 2-second cooldown instead of a 6-second cooldown. So a lot more powerful of a version than the one we have today for sure. Die Another Day is another augment I'm going to be moving up to strong but not OP. Similarly to We'll Be Right Back, it's one of the best ways to make sure you don't get absolutely blown up. The only negative of it is that the enemy team also benefits from Die Another Day almost as much. You can be knocked out of it, so against certain team comps, it's going to just feel a lot worse than We'll Be Right Back. So I just think in general, it's usually conditionally worse than We'll Be Right Back, but it still is quite good of a defensive ability because you're not able to die, which is one of the best ways to be tanky. I forgot to move Willing Sacrifice down to strong but niche. Definitely feels nice, and you can give a rather big shield, but the conditions you need is a tank who has a bunch of health that doesn't mind losing out on it, and you kind of get in these awkward scenarios where if the enemy team has like a lot of AoE, you could end up just like both dying because you're kind of like splitting up your health. So it is good in helping your carry not die, but oftentimes you'd just rather that your more tanky champion has some other effects that allows them to pump out damage, which Willing Sacrifice doesn't really help them do at all. It just helps the carry survive, and in some scenarios, it's not even enough for them to survive, especially if like the enemies build Shield Break, for instance, then Willing Sacrifice is, again, just a lot weaker. Even though I recently found out that I'm allergic to wheat, I really do like all of the bread and augments. But I do think that in general, bread and jam is a bit weaker than the other ones. Because usually your W is more your like unconventional, interesting spell like Thresh Lantern, Lux W. I mean, it's good if you're like playing Silas, I guess. Or like Galio, I for some reason always get bread and jam on. That being said, I do think bread and butter and bread and cheese usually are better because like your Q is usually like your staple ability and your E is oftentimes like your dash ability because Riot Games loves doing that, or like a solid CC ability. So they're all pretty solid, and of course it's going to vary based on champion to champion. I'm just going to differentiate them a little bit by moving the W1 down one space, because there's just not as many champions that I'm really afraid of their W. In the OP tier, we're going to have a lot of additions, and sadly they're going to end up coming from the game-breaking category, just because I want to differentiate the truly game-breaking augments from some of the ones that are just relatively strong. I think Minion Mancer is a very good augment, but it's only for Annie and Ivern, and it does have the negative side effect where if the enemies are able to kill your pets or like kite them, then it isn't like game breaking. It's really good on that one item that gives you a bunch of spawns, then it can be like more game breaking, but that's more of a niche case. So I'm going to put it in an OP tier because I do think it is very strong, but just because like you can't control a pet as well as you can control yourself usually, I do think it's a bit weaker and not game breaking. Firebrand, I think, is definitely OP. It's really good. I just think that on-hit champions are a little bit weaker than they were before with a lot of the arena changes. Just like a lot of the on-hit champions received a ton of nerfs in general because they were kind of overtaking the game. So it definitely is like one of the best augments for them to get if you're dealing with really tanky champions. If you can apply firebrand a bunch of times, it will do a bunch of damage. But you do have to be able to basic attack a bunch, so if you do get one shot, it's not as powerful. But in the cases where you're able to free hit, firebrand will do amazing damage against those tanks. The other two augments I'm going to be bumping down are Twice Thrice and Scopier Weapons. I definitely think these augments are OP, but I don't think they're game breaking as much anymore. Just again, they have nerfed so many of the on-hit champions. On-hit items themselves, I'm pretty sure, have been hit. One thing that's actually interesting that I don't think has been really talked about that much is they removed a lot of the like AP, AD scaling on, like, for instance, like Nashor's Tooth no longer scales with both. So it's kind of a random tangent, but I do think just in general, the on-hit items are a little bit weaker. They're still OP. They're still very strong. I think Scopier Weapons is very good if you're a melee champion, especially because it can just enable you to play so much more differently because people are so much more used to kiting you in a unique way. It's good if you're a ranged champion. It doesn't like help you specifically deal more damage, but it does help you play better so that you are able to do more damage, which is very, very handy. Now, the game-breaking gold augments, I think, are absolutely ridiculous. I already talked about vulnerability, how that can just end up doing so much damage with specific scenarios where it does literally define some games. We are going to get another addition to game-breaking, even though we just removed a bunch, and that's going to actually be from the awkward tier list. We're going to move up ethereal weapons. And what ethereal weapons does is your abilities apply on-hit effects at 100% effectiveness, and it's honestly kind of hard to describe just how good this potentially can be, but there's just like a bunch of really wacky champions that can utilize this. I'm pretty sure, like, just off the top of my head, maybe like a Shyvana W could constantly proc like Bork, for instance. Maybe like your Swain ultimate could proc a bunch of on-hit items. Like I've talked about so much, on-hit items in general, on-hit damage is really powerful. One of the most infamous ones, funny ones, is like if you press Blitzcrank E and then you, like, for instance, ultimate, it will knock them up. It will lock actually everybody up, I'm pretty sure, because it will apply your Blitzcrank E to your ultimate. So there's just so many weird things. I can imagine if you press like Renekton W, if you then Q, you could like stun them. There's just so many different combos you can do. It's getting pretty late in the video, so it's hard for me to visualize all of them now. Just know, I do believe that in the right scenarios, this can be an absolutely game-breaking and hilarious augment that I definitely underestimated before. But you'll see, like, throughout the game, sometimes the ethereal weapon will just proc, like, a bunch of times, and proccing those very powerful on-hit effects is very good. Now, I'm just going to quickly talk about Mark's Mage, even though I'm not moving it. Having your basic attacks deal bonus physical damage equal to 100% AP, absolutely bonkers. You can get so much AP. Like, if you have 800 AP, each one of your autos is now all of a sudden just doing 800 extra physical damage on top of, like, the base of, let's say, 100. So 900 autos coming from your mage. Insane. Literally insane amounts of damage. You'll see every time you see Mark's Mage, the amount of damage it'll end up saying is just absolutely bonkers. So very easily a game-breaking augment. Then I'm actually going to have a shift in first place. You could make an argument that Phenomenal Evil belongs in top 2 or 8th for the champions that don't utilize it that well. But for the champions that utilize it well, like Brand, Lilia, most mages, honestly, they've just made it a lot easier, I feel, for like the mages that weren't as good to proc it. You just end up getting like ridiculous amounts of AP. Usually it's with like poison champions, all of this. So Phenomenal Evil, definitely game breaking if you're able to get to that late game level. There are some games that you will get 8th place with Phenomenal Evil. There's some games where you'll get 8th place with Ethereal Weapons. There's some games where you'll get 8th place with Vulnerability. And there's some games where you'll get 8th place with Apex Inventor, but doesn't mean I don't think those are some of the most high roll augments you can get, where you can change any champion from being like really bad to really strong. And I think Apex Inventor is just simply the best. It grants you 300 item haste. And I think this is just so overpowered on tanks. It just makes the class so ridiculously good. You have Sunfire, which will do so much more damage, as I believe it works on Sunfire. You could build an item like Fimbulwinter and just get so many more shields. You could build an item like Sundered Sky, get so many more procs. Eclipse, really good procs. But the best one by far is Unending Despair. I mean, if you played Earth at all, you'll just remember how broken Earth plus Unending Despair was. And Apex Inventor and Unending Despair is no difference. You're just healing so much. You're dealing so much damage. It's absolutely bonkers. You're also getting more Heartsteel procs. Apex Inventor just turns tanks into absolute monsters. It's super duper good on bruiser champions as well. And for all those reasons, I definitely think it belongs in the game-breaking category. Well, thank you guys so much for watching my Gold Augments tier list. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave it a like. Next up, I will be working on the Prismatic Augments tier list, so if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe. I'll also be finally releasing some champion tier lists for Arena, because I just realized exactly how I want to do that. I have worked on it a little bit in the past, so you'll be able to see that shortly. But once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and best of luck on your own Arena adventures.